the second that I changed my willingness around it, and the second that I allowed myself to consider a different way, there was just things presented themselves to me.
Welcome to the Ignited Recovery Podcast, a new way forward for anyone looking for answers but feeling left out. If you've been searching for empowerment, triumph, and purpose, you've found them right here. You won't hear the same solutions, and you're not going to have any excuses to fall back on, because Ignited Recovery allows heroes to rise and become their best selves. I'm Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I can't wait to be your guide on this journey. Are you ready to become an ignited hero? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Ignited Recovery Secrets Podcast. I'm Adi Jaffe, and today's one of those interview days. I love these days because I get to share with you guys some of what other people are doing in the world, and Holly Whitaker is one of those people. So, when I was in academia, when I was studying and researching addiction, the outside world seemed pretty simple. There were research studies being done on what addiction techniques work and what treatments work. And we were sort of told, follow these guides, follow the evidence-based practices. And it wasn't until later in that part of my career, the postdoc years, I'll call them, the 3 years after I graduated and started doing some more independent kind of research and studies, that I actually made a realization, and that is almost nobody out there is doing what's called evidence-based practice. People would be studying it in academia, and the way that would look, just so you can kind of understand what the lay of the land is, the government would give grants, like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, known as SAMHSA, or the National Institutes of Health, would give money to researchers to go out and study techniques. And they would put together these studies, and they would go to these research center addiction treatment places, normally treatment places that were offering treatment primarily to poor and underprivileged or homeless individuals, or the VA, the Veterans Administration was a popular one. And in those places, they would study techniques, and based on the studies, they would report back what works and what does not. That was my holy grail. And I was like, hey, nobody out there is using it. I'd gone to rehab. I knew they weren't using any of these techniques. They just had in-house AA meetings, and then they would take us to outside AA meetings. So I was starting to study the periphery of what was going on. And I would actually go to these meetings and I'd say, hey, why is nobody talking about the fact that AA is almost the only thing that's being done out there? And people would be very upset when I would bring that up. And so there would be these places, they would do the studies, and the moment the government money dried up, and this was a very commonly understood problem, the moment the grants ran out, the studies would stop, and the clinicians wouldn't have money anymore from the government, so they would typically stop doing a lot of the fancier stuff that they were doing and go back to the free stuff, the AA, free meetings, hopefully some smart recovery meetings, things of that nature. We'll have a link to smart recovery below here as well. Okay, so that's how I left school. And I went out to a place called Matrix Institute at the time, started running some groups. They were actually running evidence-based practices. It was like this workshop-based, booklet-based treatment. So it was all in groups, and it was based on a book that they had written that had shown efficacy. It had shown that it was successful. The thing is, I was doing these treatments in 2012, and they had shown that it was successful in 1986 with meth users, and yet we're using it with everybody because that's what they had. So once again, I was realizing two completely different worlds. What's happening in academia in terms of what people believe should be done in treatment and what was actually done in the universe. That's when I found harm reduction. That's when I found all these things that made me leave and start my own rehab center. Nobody was talking about the work we're doing now. And part of it was because it wasn't available. Technology wasn't allowing us to do what we're doing now. But the other reason was, sometimes knowledge advances way, way faster than research can catch up. This little statistic here might boggle your mind, but it takes 15 to 20 years on average for groundbreaking research academic knowledge to make it into the field. About 15 years. That means that as people are discovering what is best practices, it's going to take almost another generation for that to affect people on the ground. And I wasn't really willing to wait. I was reading about all these things, mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy and DBT, even some efficacy for hypnosis and all these other more esoteric things that I was looking at. And when Alternatives, the treatment center I used to co-own, closed, I decided I wanted to get into that field. I didn't even know that a lot of people were doing online work because it was just not discussed that broadly. Fast forward to now, and you've got Annie Grace and This Naked Mind. You've got Holly Whitaker, who you're going to hear an interview with today, who started something called Hip Sobriety that has recently been changed to the Tempest because even they understood that sobriety was not the thing that people were going after. And we all now live in this really interesting world where if you need help for alcohol or drug addiction or anything like that, you can tune in and get help directly from the people you want help with. That's a pretty incredible development, right? Like before, if there was a researcher that did some amazing study that discovered a new technique for help with addiction, you couldn't get help from them. You would at best get some help from somebody who was trained by somebody they trained. Well, that train has left the station. That ship has sailed. We are now in this place where if you like the work that I do, guess what? Come see my free workshop on Friday. We're actually promoting a new workshop that I'll have the link for here at the bottom for a needs and motivation workshop to help you understand what it is that you need to be happy and live a happy life. But if you like what Holly teaches, you can go to the Tempest and get taught by her and her coaches. And that is a brand new version of this world of addiction help. And I welcome it because I've always said that what we need is a larger menu for people to pick from. And now I think we have a much, much larger menu that, by the way, doesn't have to cost $10,000 a month, doesn't require you to go to your boss and ask for 30 days off so you can go to rehab, doesn't require the shame, at least in my work, and I believe in some of Holly's work as well, for you to stand up in front of a bunch of people and say, hey, my name is Adi and I'm an addict. I think these are all amazing advances. You know me, my goal is to bring you as many options as possible. So stay tuned. Listen to what Holly has to say. We had a really candid, very open conversation as we usually do on this podcast. And I think you'll really, really love it. Don't forget, again, if you want some help and you haven't seen what I do yet, we've got a free workshop today. As this gets released in a couple of hours, we will have a link under. So you can go right now. The link is bit.ly.com/free recovery workshop with the first letter of each one of those words capitalized. We'll have the link below for you as well. And you can get my version of what will help you. As I mentioned, we're also releasing a brand new workshop that I'm doing. It's like $47 as a special for those of you who are interested. And it's all about motivation and needs research and what it is that will make you happier. I think that's a pretty amazing goal. So check out this interview with Holly. I hope to see you next week and have an amazing, amazing weekend, y'all. We're here with Holly Whitaker, the creator of Hip Sobriety School, which is now Tempest. And you know, Holly, I wasn't even aware of you until about 2.5 years ago. And this shift happened to me about 2.5 years ago where I was a full academic. 2.5 years ago, I was still fully immersed in academia. Mm-hmm. I went to harm reduction conferences. I went to academic conferences. I presented my own research, et cetera. I owned a treatment center, but I still lived in the world of looking at what was possible and what is out there only through the lens that I knew to look through. And that's always the life we live.
And what lens was that?
So the idea that there are research findings about what is and isn't useful, that is the privy of the academic world.
Yeah.
So universities and public institutions fund studies. And that what I knew was that on the ground, and this is where I think my blind spot I'm saying was, on the ground, almost all of treatment is AA and 12-step based. Mm-hmm. The only help people have is going to a therapist and then the therapist does whatever they want. But if you go to specialty treatment for alcohol or drug addiction, that, you know, what you had was rehabs. And I was trying to break that mold, but it felt really lonely. Mm-hmm. And I met Annie Grace sitting in San Diego at the harm reduction conference. Mm-hmm. No idea she had a book, no idea who she was. She was coming there to learn about harm reduction. We ended up sitting on the floor for 2.5 hours talking about what does this world of harm reduction looks like. And I feel like it was a collision of two worlds.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that there was that way of doing things. And by that, I mean all the things we're going to talk about with what you've done with Hip Sobriety and in that world. No idea that Annie existed before that moment. And what I've realized over the last couple of years is that there's been this, I'll call it an underground movement, although with the use of technology now, even underground can look pretty above ground if you do the right work.
And do you mean underground because it's not through the lens of like mental health or behavioral health or medical? Like underground because it's not coming from the authorities of what is and isn't okay in terms of treatment? Or
I mean that to some extent, and I think we'll get to this in a really direct way. A lot of people think we're crazy.
Yeah.
And what I mean is, what we're doing right now is like the punk of music. We're like the punk music of the addiction industry. And it's weird that I've ended up back here. Actually, this is the first time I've actually put that analogy in place. But like, I was in a punk band in high school. I made industrial music growing up. Like, I've always been on the outskirts.
Yeah. But so was Bill Wilson.
100%. I mean, forget the fact that he was hallucinating when he was looking for some of the ways to get past his own demons, right? No, you're right. You're totally right.
Yeah. And like it is, I think it's so like there's so much, I think it's so interesting. I don't know if you've ever read any of Thomas Szasz' work. He was an early psychiatrist who was a dissenter of psychiatry. And he talked about everything as like his lens was essentially that we went from his book Ceremonial Chemistry is just brilliant. It talks about how we went through the policing of society through the lens of through the church, and then we moved it to the medical institution, that we police society through medicalization. And so in that, like we deem what is like we deem what is right and what is not right through the lens of medicine. And so I think it's so interesting because when you look at what Bill Wilson did, which was, yes, he's a hallucinogen, which is now, by the way, back in vogue,
right?
And again, like once again, medicalized and will proliferate through the medical establishment, not through counterculture, not through any other means, but that. I think it's just so interesting that like how we've gotten here, and then yet what we deem as like the medical standard was something that a stockbroker came up with from his own experience.
At a time where medicine was nascent. I mean, medicine was barely developed enough to understand what a disease is.
Yes.
I have this whole workshop that I literally called, Are You Really an Alcoholic? And I walk people through the fact that the alcoholic disease was created as a term in the mid 1800s, like pre-virus and bacterial detection. Yeah. Before we knew what a disease was, we called this thing a disease. And I get it. It was an advance at the time. But somebody today, and this is the reason why I was calling this underground, what we're doing is somebody today was saying, well, Dr. Wilkes wrote in 1930 about addiction as a disease. And I go, yeah, but how many other doctors are you quoting from the 1900s, from the early 1900s? Like
as saying that they came up with an answer then, and it now today still stands. Yeah. It's so interesting.
And so here's the thing, right? Underground doesn't mean bad. It doesn't actually mean good either. It just means this swell movement that's developing.
Yeah.
The way I think most people know it, maybe not in this podcast because people have been listening to me for a while, but I hope to expose them to what you're doing in here as well. But in general society, that term sober curious is kind of the closest thing that people have gotten to understand the sort of work that we do.
Yeah.
I like it because the curious word, right? I've been saying for years to people, like, why not just open up your mind to what is possible?
Yeah.
And then not believe, since you're walking into a world you don't know.
Yeah.
Don't believe you know the rules by which that game is played. Don't believe you know where the fence is because you've never been here. So
that's right.
So don't like, again, I'm an ex-meth addict. I've had sex addiction issues in my past. The thing that bothers me the most is not even those identifications, because I feel like over the 20 years, I've done a pretty good job of understanding where I fall within that. But it's everybody else's expectation that because I say that to them, they know something about me.
Yeah.
And so I want to go back to your story a little bit, because you didn't get to lead a movement of women primarily, right? Primarily women?
Yeah, primarily women, though about 90% women and about 10% men. And then also we actually like about 3% gender nonconforming. Yeah, mostly women. Yeah, at this point.
So you didn't, I got my degree in psychology. It was somewhat expected that I would end up in a helping profession of some sort, either through the research field or clinical. But you didn't. You were in the tech world, right, in Silicon Valley, in a completely different life trajectory to some extent than where you ended up. And what I'd love, I know you talk about your story quite a bit. It's not like you're shy about it, but I think a lot of people are where you were, living their life, believing they're following the rules, believing they're doing what they're supposed to do to get where they're supposed to get in life. And all the other things that we talk about, the anxiety, the depression, the medication through drugs, sex, alcohol, gambling, food, whatever that is, they sort of see that as just par for the course. They just kind of see that as the things you do to be able to live the life that you want. Now, you used to believe that, and then something shifted, and I'd love to understand, and for our people to hear the story of how did you come about creating this change in your own life?
Yeah. So I wrote the book Quit Like a Woman. Then I also it's called Tempest now. It used to be called Hip Sobriety, because I think like the key distinction is, I think, how women become addicted, especially to alcohol, how women quit and how women can recover is something that is largely unaddressed. And I think that is like the end result of what started as I was doing exactly as you said. I started drinking in my teens in high school. I went through college. I got a degree in a field I thought would make me money and bring me stability. And I had this idea that of basically, if I acquire all these outside trappings of what a life is supposed to look like, which included making alcohol work, which included, right, like being the right size and saying the right things and having the right amount of money, that I would be happy. And I was never happy. And I had a moment, I had many moments where it was just continuously like, how long do I keep this up for? And like, when do I get to that point where this actually starts to feel like something I just can't wait to escape from? And I think there was a crossroads of, I worked in tech, but I also worked at a company that just IPO'd in the healthcare field that was bringing greater access to primary care. And I had an experience of, being steeped in that. My job was director of revenue cycle management, which means I just was constantly reviewing healthcare contracts and like trying to figure out how people can use their insurance card to get healthcare. I was in that role in a very progressive, forward-thinking company meant to make healthcare more accessible. And then I had an experience where I was dying from trying to keep that all up. Oof. And I went and I talked to my doctor and said, hey, I have, bulimia, like I'm drinking this much. And within that setting of what I was creating that thought would save people like me, I was told I can go to AA or I can go to rehab. So I started something because I started Tempest because I believed, and I had the experience of being quite smarter than my doctor, like because I was forced to being smarter than my doctors. Doctors, as you know, are typically attend 12-step meetings. They are not trained in addiction medicine. And the healthcare system puts Band-Aids on things. Your book gets right to this, like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Not what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And the healthcare system does not address why are we doing this. It just addresses what, and it tries to put a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah.
And so I started pulling together because my vantage point in that position was, I am a person with means. I am sick. No one knows how to actually help me in a meaningful way. I am referred out of the system. My insurance card does not work. And no one is talking about this. Before the opioid epidemic, no one was talking writ large about how to change addiction and upgrade it or I'm sorry, addiction recovery and like bring it into, the 20th century or the 21st century. And so I think,
mean, even in the opioids epidemic, everybody keeps talking about fentanyl and carfentanil and synthetic opioids, which are important and are contributing to overdose rates, et cetera. And that is an important part of the conversation. But that old commercial from the 80s and 90s, like nobody grew up saying, I want to be an addict.
Drug addict when I get older.
Remember that one? Yeah. So that one, that still holds true. The problem with that commercial is it still made it about the person. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, you're an addict versus you're the accumulation of the experiences that you've had in life, which have led you to this place. And I think from what I've seen in the work that you do, and how do you even get that insight, right? Like, I know how I got it. I went to school and I'm starting to study addiction. And I realized I just went to rehab. I went to rehab and I was sober in 12 steps for almost 3 years. And then I go to school. I'm like, wait, these things don't fucking match up. Like,
that's right.
The things I'm learning about addiction in psychology in school and the things that I'm learning about addiction in the rooms are not at all related. And I had to make a decision. I had to leap and go, I'm going to leave that thing behind, when everybody kind of looked at me like I was insane.
Yeah, you're going to die if you don't keep doing the thing.
Jails, institutions, or, on the streets or whatever. So those are like the things that I was told. I was literally verbatim pretty much told, I mean, you can take the leap. A lot of us have taken the experiment, but you're insane for doing it. And
you better stay safe. You better follow our rules. Yeah. Don't think for yourself. It's so you're asking, I mean, you made the leap beyond, and your life had been saved by the rules, right? And you talk about rules a lot, and I talk about them too. And then you went against them. And I think that's the crux of, I think, what my work is, which is typically it's institution before person. And that's like, I mean, that's documented in the 12 steps, in the 12 traditions, actually. And that's also just typically how an institution in our society keeps its power. The institution is smarter than the individual. And so this is written into the traditions in like self-silencing, anonymity, and like specifically, again, like to put the institution before the personal experience, to put the sangha or the team, but like it still leads to don't question, follow. And I think that there is for me, that was the scariest part of it, because your insight came 3 years in, when your exterior, when things started to basically collide for you. My collision happened before I stopped drinking.
Yeah.
I read Alan Carr's book, which is very similar to Annie Grace's work. Yep. And I was just like, oh, I get it. And then I started doing my own research, and I did not believe that 12 steps had to save my life. And so I think when I come back to it, one of the things that powers my conviction is that humans are so smart about their own experience, and what freedom means to them is not going to be the same. What freedom means to me is not the same as it's going to mean to you. Yeah. What works for me is not going to be the same as what works for you. And that agency is what has been stripped of us, is what makes us sick. This belief that we can't determine our own best course. And that by reigniting that and letting the person actually decide what their course of action is and what their life will be like is so important in the healing.
I love it. I mean, there's a reason why the first step is around powerlessness, right? The idea is you don't know what to do. Let us tell you, but then don't tell anybody else that we did that, because, we want to protect in case you fuck up. Like if you screw this up, we don't want that to come back on us.
Yeah.
We'll pick and choose what sort of stories we get to tell the world. And here's the reality, right? From my experience personally, and then I, reading yours and knowing Annie, and then the hundreds and hundreds of people that I've seen going through doing these steps that I've lived by, and then obviously the thousands that you've helped. The reality is there's an infinite number of different recovery stories. And by that, I mean tools used and experiences. Some people keep drinking and it's not a problem for them. Some people can't do it ever again. Now, when I say can't, that doesn't mean there's no reality in which they can do it. But, you deal with people, you talk to people about this all the time. I do as well. People come to us loaded up with life experience,
Yeah.
shame, trauma, anxiety, depression, self-defeating concepts of who they are and what they can achieve in life. All those things kind of become this bouillabaisse, like this soup in their head, right? Of the reality that they're living in. And I see it sometimes as my job just to shake them up a little bit and say, look, just because this is where you've gotten up to now in life doesn't mean this is where you're going to get stuck. I love some of Tom Bilyeu's stuff. If you follow him at all, about this kind of like,
no.
So
who?
Impact Theory, Tom Bilyeu. He and his wife created Quest bars, Quest Nutrition. So his stuff is really, really big on this concept that, look, if humans are one thing, we're adaptable.
Yeah, that's right.
And so tell me what the goal is, show me some tools to get there, and odds are I'm going to find a way to do it.
That's right.
So I know a little bit about the inner workings of what you guys do, but you discovered a path for yourself early on. You didn't even stop drinking yet, and you discovered this path. How do you go about it? Like, what are the literal steps you took in your own life to go from my life is falling apart and I don't know where it's going, I don't like this anymore, and there's no system to help me, to creating your own system?
Yeah, I think there was the moment of, I think like talking about bottoms is really important. I like how Tommy Rosen puts it, which is it's the moment you start telling the truth to yourself. I think there was an entire life of an entire life pattern of not telling the truth to myself. And then finally just saying the truth out loud, which was, I can't do this. This is not working out for me. And alcohol is part of it. I think there was just the first, we call it the reckoning here, which is just, I think there's, the way we talk about, the way Tempest talks about a lot of this stuff is we talk about, there's just like total lack of awareness. I have no idea that anything's wrong. And then there starts to be this unfolding around it. And I had an unfolding around it. It was just like little clues that I was picking up from how I wanted to live, that this didn't have to be the only way, and then eventually there was just an impact moment of, I cannot do this anymore. And I don't want to do this anymore. And so from there, I'm just a naturally curious person that likes to research. And so I researched Amazon for books on how to change your relationship with alcohol. And I bought one called The Easy Way to Control It, which was the only way I could have stepped in.
I love it.
Because I could not go in for forever. I needed to figure out how to keep alcohol in my life, but just not have it destroy me.
I mean, that's why I call my book The Abstinence Myth, to be honest.
That's right. Because it's a way in, so that people 100%. Are able to, there's such a high bar to being able to examine something that's so terrifying. We need to lower that so that people can make up their own minds, but also the information at earlier states. Because it takes on average about 10 years from onset to seeking treatment. Yeah. And so to allow people to have interventions at an earlier stage and to consider, it might just look like, I hate that I come home every single night from work and I feel like I have to go through this routine, drinking a couple glasses of wine to make it through my night. So for me, anyway, coming back to my story, there was just I had this moment of okay, I need to change this. I started to do research. And I think that that's a really important piece to this, is that it unfolded on itself. The second that I changed my willingness around it, and the second that I allowed myself to consider a different way, there was just things presented themselves to me. I bought Eckhart Tolle's book, I love it. A New World. I bought I found Gabby Bernstein in Bloomberg Magazine and started to read her work, her interpretations of A Course in Miracles. I started to see a therapist, which I had never done in my later adult life, and that opened doors. And so for me, it wasn't I did these exact things. I started to piece together a way forward with absolutely zero intention of being in recovery or ever calling myself an alcoholic, which I eventually did. But I think it was just, I started to move forward in a series of steps. And what I did with Tempest was eventually just I figured out, how can I take what happened, what worked for me, and actually put it into a template so that anybody can come and pick it up and actually can make a way through it without having it look like mine. It's just we essentially help people understand what the pillars of a successful and holistic recovery looks like, versus what is included within each of those pillars.
I love it. this act of self-exploration, I think you're right. A lot of people don't do it, sometimes out of self-defense, because we know there's a lot brewing, and it's a little bit of that Pandora's box story, right? We know, well, if I start looking at this, I'm going to have to look at the whole thing, and I'm not quite ready for that. So let me not look at it today.
Mm-hmm.
And we keep just stacking and just dropping more demons and more ghosts and more evil into that box until one day it's kind of brimming over. And like you said, you have to have a moment of reckoning. I really hope, and the reason I love that this movement is growing so much is, my joke is we should make recovery so easy to start that you can stumble into it. I mean,
That's
literally
right.
like drunk stumble, fall into and go, oh, I didn't realize I was getting help. I'm getting help.
That's right. That's right.
And so first of all, technology has made this completely different now. 15, 20 years ago, you would have had your experience and maybe you would have written a book about it. And then whoever read the book would get an influence. And then maybe 5, 10, 15 years later, it would be a movement. But now we have these tools. And these tools are powerful, right? Because what happens is somebody links up with your story. They really connect. You go, oh, Holly's like me. I'm where she was, or somewhere close enough to it to relate. And now it's not just about, let me read what Holly has done, but it's more like, wait, Holly can help me. And they get to connect. Now, you came from the tech world. So was that a pretty easy leap?
God, no. I mean, I came from a world of understanding, like, I believe that venture capital is rocket fuel. I think that was, and I didn't start doing what I was doing to create something small. I wanted to, there was a lot of stuff I think that felt very obvious and necessary to me at the beginning. And one was just like introducing a concept of pre-addiction. I think 2 is introducing a concept of holistic recovery that wasn't measured in just not palliative care, but just in like single episodic, like fixing the symptom type care. Yeah. I think there was a need for us to actually help individuals. I mean, it's called social determinants of care at this point, but like back then it was just what's actually getting in the way. Like Alexandra Drain coined a term called the unmentionables. And I think for what I was seeing at that time was there's a holistic view of looking at a human, and all of that has to be fixed if a human is not going to try and numb themselves out of their life. Anonymity and the anonymity factor of this, it being so hard for me to find friends at first and other people because I didn't go the traditional route, that really played a huge role in it. I think there was just so many pieces that I felt like if you give people easier ways in, if you actually expand the scope of what addiction looks like from this very like in spectrum view that we have to actually include anybody that struggles on the spectrum. If you introduce pre and preventative care, if you give basically this like kind of makeover to the way that addiction is treated. And also we look at the words we use, and we also look at the way the criminal justice system is involved. Yeah. And we also look at the way that all drugs are policed and this one legal drug is really forced upon us. And like, so essentially if we give like this kind of not just makeover to the addiction recovery system, but also to how we talk about drinking alcohol, to all the way up to like giving just like sobriety, maybe some good PR, then we can change a lot of things around how we drink, how we quit, how we recover. And so it wasn't like, it was just essentially, I saw what existed. I saw how much people in general were interested in talking about addiction and recovery. And I saw how deeply confusing most people are about alcohol in of itself. And we also we do a lot of work. Tempest does a lot of work. I've done a lot of work around just talking about alcohol, the way it's marketed to us. And like 50% at the height of like addiction to cigarette addiction and consumption, 50% or 45% of a U.S. adult smoked, 70% of U.S. adults drink. And so and not only that, we are marketing it to each other in ways that it was, like the same thing that you said, we can now spread this concept of recovery. Well, Virginia Slims and all of that like propaganda that tried to convince women to smoke. All of that stuff was actually within the context of like no social media. And so all of those marketing tactics by big tobacco existed within the confines of a society that wasn't fueled by influencers and social media. But today with alcohol, you see the rates of addiction popping among women. And you also see like how much that is influenced by what you see on social media. We're marketing it to each other. So you have a totally different landscape with a very addictive drug, growing rates of addiction. We also want to change the conversation we have around alcohol.
I love it. It's funny. I don't know. I don't think any substance is evil. I don't think any behavior is bad in its own right. I think doing things mindlessly and not really paying attention to what you're doing is the crux. And we live in a society that distracts us so much from the marketing and the consumerism standpoint to what we have to get and what we have to do in order to get those things that we miss ourselves in the way. You end up at 70 or 80 years old going, oh fuck, I didn't do half of the shit that I wanted to do because I was too busy chasing this dream. And there is no dream. Like I tell all my students, all my clients, we know the end point. Like where the finish line is, and you don't want to get there. None of us want to get to the finish line. The finish line is when we stop breathing.
Yeah.
You're going to get there. We know you're going to get there. So what is your life going to look like when you get there?
Yeah.
How are you going to look back at it? Right. And there's so many cliches about it. It's not even funny. And I don't need to reiterate them here, but the whole idea that at the end, nobody dies and goes, well, thankfully I had that yacht. Like that's not the thing that you remember in the end. Is you go, it's the relationships and the people that you're with and the impact that you left. Those are the things that matter. And I'm a huge believer because people, going back to the fact that this is an underground movement, people have learned to depend so much on the traditional solutions. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you get this. I get this all the time. I just got off the phone call with somebody who wrote me an email on this general topic last night. People look at us sideways. They look at us a little weird. Like, well, why are you doing it this way? Everybody knows addiction is a disease. NIDA's been saying it for years. Stop it. You're just trying to get people's money.
Yeah, right.
I get that all the time. Like,
yeah.
10 to 15 times a day. And I'll be honest, this is where ego gets in the way for me a little bit. It grates on me. And it grates on me because I know the intention behind the work that I'm doing. I also know the lives that it's saved and the other people who write to me. And so I have proof, like anecdotal proof in my head. Doing the research on this is hard. I'm trying to do as much of it as I can. And it's, small sample size and not a lot of money. It makes it hard. But how do you deal with, I would say you're maybe not the tip of the spear, but you're part of the front of the spear of this new online movement.
Yeah.
What has that experience been like for you once you started not being anonymous about it? You started getting out about it. What has the personal impact been on you from both sides? You're helping people and yeah.
I mean, I like the main thing. I think it's the money conversation. I love the money conversation because first of all, I didn't start doing this to make money. I wasn't like, what's going to be really lucrative is this. I started to do this because there was something in me that could not do it because I had an intersection of too much awareness around what was absolutely necessary, where I had been failed, where money goes to in healthcare. And I thought that there could be something between, like we treat of like the severely addicted, like 10% of people, or like, I think it's like some total 2% of individuals are going to get like any sort of treatment.
I have a slide in my presentation I call my 90-91. 90% of people don't go to get treatment. 90% of people who go to get treatment fail based on our accepted criteria, which means that out of every 100 people who need help, one currently gets help using our system, which is freaking insane.
And you're still actually like that still is looking at, and like that's still looking at like within the spectrum of addiction we recognize.
Sure.
You pull that back out and you look at things that are like what I would count as like pre-addiction or just like early dependence, and you end up with a lot fewer people. Yeah. We've put the number just specifically in alcohol. With our research, we put the number at, I think, about 2 million to 51 million actually are getting any sort of help. But regardless, it's abysmally low. Yes. And so we have, you have essentially a free system that was made in the 1930s, and it was made with a very specific archetype that does not work on everybody. You have this one free solution, and it's also for in-spectrum addiction. And then you have a very cost prohibitive solution that very few people access. And I created something, and we have been through our first outcomes. So our first clinical outcomes, we've been through our first outcome study that was done by University of Buffalo. And it works. And it works for the people that we are intending for it to work for, which is individuals that are somewhere in the middle of it, or people that don't want to go the traditional route, or that can't actually go the traditional route. So we have a product, and I employ 45 people as of today, and we pay them well to do very good work that's actually effective in a gap that existed within the market. And there's a lot to this. Like, first, people that use, like the typical comment I get is, well, AA is free. AA is one facet of recovery. It's community and it's spiritual investigation. And that is not like at all talking about what happens to your brain chemicals. We're not talking about physiological issues. We're not talking about environmental issues. It does not get you, health insurance. It is not a doctor visit. It is not therapy. So I think there's also understanding, first of all, people actually pay for recovery because it's an expensive thing. And so people do spend money on it. Just because they're using a free program doesn't mean the free program suffices for everything. But also the other piece of this is there's so few, we don't talk about how inappropriate it is to pay real estate brokers or doctors or bank tellers
or psychologists
or psychiatrists. So I think it's also just, we have trained ourselves to undervalue addiction treatment. We've trained ourselves to believe it is not worthy of spending money on or mortgaging our houses on, and nothing in between. And so we actually provide a really good service that works. That has a cost to it. Like everything in our capitalist system.
Everything in even a socialist system, you just pay into the system. In a socialist system, it's not like that's different. You just have to give your money from your work to the socialist system to provide you with the services. What I think is interesting, and the proof for me is always, AA is free. So why are only 12 to 15% of people ever trying it? And why are the 90% of people not there within a year? The proof is there. Look, the people who are attracted to that system find it and stay. And
they get to use that,
and then
right?
It's pretty successful, which is great.
Yes.
But obviously, look, if 95% of people who went into AA stayed forever and got success, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, because my entire job would be to just direct people there. But
that's right.
That's just not the way it works. So, it's funny. The reason I asked that question is I don't even know. I mean, I talked to Annie. I know some of the Annie experiences, but I don't know. This is the reason why I was saying it's underground, right? It's to me, it's like the punk scene of the 80s. I don't even know what the rest of us go through. And if anybody...
It's not fun, but I mean, Annie and I are friends. We've talked about this stuff before. I think I've had to, first of all, I think it's really important to distinguish. I don't believe AA should be dismantled. I believe there should be plenty more options. I believe that there's a lot of things that need to be fixed in this arena. And welcome. And I think this is proof of it. You and Annie and I are not competitors.
Nope.
We are we're a support system of people that believe there should be more options, and 100%. That people don't actually, recover the same, and we need a lot. We need a lot here. So I think that it comes back to this belief of I do this because I couldn't not, and because when I was trying to get sober, there was nothing that existed that actually saw me and me and my experience, or that validated me and my experience. And it won't always be this way, but it is. It's a lonely place.
It is. It's a lonely place. Look, I love that we get to have this conversation, because I think it is about the intermingling of all the solutions, so that everybody hears about everything that's out there. And then you find the little piece that attracts you, and like moth, you just fly towards it, and hopefully it helps you. And so we'll definitely have links to the book. We'll have links to Tempest and all those sorts of things in the show notes. Is there, I have classic stories in my head that are the things that get me going. Because in light of all that difficulty, I know that every single time I get an email, a letter, a Facebook post from somebody who goes, oh my God, my life is different now. Is there one that sticks in your head you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think I think this goes to how important it is that we share our stories. When I was first getting sober, I started posting about it on my Facebook page and on my Instagram account. And when I quit my job, I was so lost because I felt so, it just felt like such a wild proposition to do what I'm doing now. And I was walking one night just in total doubt. And one of my friends from college reached out to me and said, hey, look, I'm terrified, but I have been terrified of my drinking for a long time. What do I do? Where do I start? How do I do this? And I still get those today, but that was only because I was sharing on Facebook, like, about how much sobriety I had, about when, like, the last time I had a drink was, that I was, like, proud of the choices that I was making. And I ended up connecting with somebody that otherwise probably wouldn't have been ready to look at it herself. And she's stopped drinking. I mean, she's been in recovery now for, oh God, whatever, like, I don't know, since maybe like 6 months of that phone call.
That's awesome.
It is awesome.
And
beautiful. That's how it works, which is, again, like, I think sharing our stories, sharing our ideas, with the understanding that we don't have all truth, with the understanding that, by sharing what we believe, other people get to also believe what they do.
Yeah. And I see, again, 2 years ago, I had no awareness that this existed. I didn't have an online presence in this way either. But now, having entered it, I see more and more of this popping up. And what's beautiful about it is you can almost tell each group kind of the portion of the society that it applies to. Mm-hmm. And that it must appeal to, right? I started getting emails from, I forget this guy's name, Mark something. And he primarily goes after male executives. That's kind of his people. And it's great because, maybe they look at Tempest or they look at Andy's stuff and that doesn't really speak to them so much.
Yeah.
And so to have a voice that speaks to them, but the ideas are all similar. And that is, and that is, there's a way out of this for you. I've been there. I know the path I've taken. Let me share it with you so that you might be able to learn from it, versus a singular system where we all have to go into. And so I'm a huge fan. I just want to tell people, if you're looking for self-help in-person meetings, there's always Smart Recovery, which is a different version of in-person self-help meetings than AA.
CBT focused,
Exactly. It's more cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness focused and things of that nature. So there's refuge recovery. There's all these things that exist now that just did
Women
not.
for Sobriety, which has actually existed for a long time. But
so is SOS, Secular Organization for Sobriety.
That's right.
Life Ring. Right. There are a lot of them. Maybe actually we'll have a list at the bottom of the site.
Rational recovery, 8-step recovery. Yeah, there's a lot.
So now it's kind of like our job to create this massive toolkit so that people get to choose their tools.
That's right.
I love this. Thank you so much for jumping on with us. Congratulations on all the success.
Thank you. Same. Thank you. I was very excited to read your book and to find your work.
Yeah, it's again, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I'll keep following everything that you guys are doing. And if there's a last message you can send to all our listeners, what would it be?
Oh gosh, you're so brave for listening to a podcast like this. I think, like, no matter where you are in your journey, it's just there's so few people that can have that self-awareness to be able to continue to pull the thread, and just reminding yourself to, like, be so kind and grateful to your courage and your bravery.
Love it.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for listening. Check out Holly and her book and all the incredible work at the Tempest. And we will see you next week. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to the Ignited Heroes Recovery Podcast. I really hope you found the information here useful and that we'll see you back here next week. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast is the most useful it can be for you. So please let me know by emailing info@ignited.com. If there are any specific topics or questions
you'd like to have addressed. As usual, if you like this episode, I would love for you to leave us a 5-star review and rating. Thanks, and see you next week.